Keith Smith, Yahoo NBA, Real GM. Talks NBA with us each and every week at this time on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. The Sixers lost to the Hawks and the Magic. So, Keith, we asked the question. So many people, the Sixers can't beat the Bucks. They can't beat the Celtics. They can't beat the better team. So they beat the Bucks. They squeeze a win against the Charlotte Hornets in the middle of that game. That could have been a classic letdown game. And then they beat the Celtics. And then they go and lose the 2 games to Atlanta and Orlando. So, should the Sixer fans be concerned losing those 2 road games against lesser, inferior opponents?
No, I wouldn't be. The Magic and the Hawks are both playing quite well. Orlando had a big win last night against Miami. They won 6 straight. They've now moved into the 8th seed in the Eastern Conference, so you can consider them right in the mix for the playoffs, if not a playoff team. And then Atlanta, despite the poor record, they're 27-48. They've actually played really good basketball over the last month and a half. So I wouldn't be too concerned over those. I think the bigger deal is that they beat two of their competitors at the top of the conference, more so than losing a couple games in late March to teams that are really, Hawks trying to establish themselves and Orlando fighting for a playoff spot.
There are deficiencies that the Sixers have issues with. I mean, there's no question about it. And it's so interesting when I see these night-to-nighters, I call them, Keith. They react night to night to certain losses. But what are some of the things that aren't so night-to-night that do rear their head too often for a team like Philadelphia that people who have concern have legitimate reasons to be concerned?
I think probably the biggest is the bench depth. It's questionable at best. Right now, you're really relying on guys like James Ennis and Mike Scott to step up big and have big nights. TJ McConnell, he's going to be a consistent performer, but you're not getting exactly A-plus play there. You're probably getting more, C to B-minus kind of play out of McConnell. So those guys have to really step it up, and that's a concern if they can do that, because there's a reason why they're in the positions they're in, because they haven't been consistent performers to this point. And then the secondary, for me, is I think at times the offense still is a little clunky. I think Brett Brown has really started to experiment lately as far as how he's splitting the top 4 guys as far as Simmons, Embiid, Harris, and Butler go, and I think he's finding some things that work, finding some things that don't work, and that'll be really important for the playoffs. But the minutes when all 4 of those guys are on the floor, generally with J.J. Redick, they're still just a little tough, and they have some challenges as far as who guards quick scoring point guards. That's a problem in those lineups, so that's something that you really have to watch for.
Yeah, and there's no question that I think if there's a problem, and I want to get your take on this, because I would agree that the Sixers have deficiency in defending the guards on the perimeters. They get beat a lot. But my irrational self would say they're a poor defensive team on the perimeter. My rational self would say I watch a lot of NBA, Keith, as do you, and I see guards scoring at a high clip all over the league because you're just not allowed to touch guys anymore. So guards go off for big games because you're not allowed to defend.
No, that's definitely true. When you have a guy like James Harden, who can get to the free throw line whenever he feels like it, just by, kind of bullying into guys and, making plays. And then when teams finally are like, all right, well, we can't body him up, so we get a step back. Well, then he's just going to kill you off the bounce anyway. So that's definitely some truth to that. I think the challenge comes in the playoffs where games, like it or not, games do slow down. Every possession does matter more. You do need to be able to string together the occasional stops against guys like that. And that's what we've seen the better teams be able to do. For all their greatness as an offensive team, the Warriors are one of the best defensive basketball teams that we've ever seen, especially when they really care to be. And part of what they're able to do is they can make it tough where, Harden, instead of getting a good look or getting to the line, 3 out of every 5 times, you knock that down to 2 out of every 5 times. And in the postseason, that makes a massive difference.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll ask you then. You mentioned that the Sixers, they have had issues defending the guys out on the perimeter. They don't have your classic point guard, who's 6'2", 6'3", has the foot speed and can kind of defend. Is that going to be something come playoff time that's going to be an issue for them? Or do you think that come playoff time, a Ben Simmons or a Jimmy Butler can kind of be that guy that they say, look, we need a 7-game series out of you to defend the guy on the point. You can't ask him to do it 82 games every single night, but in a series, can you do it for me? Do they have that guy?
Yeah, I think the challenge is it's not just asking them to do it in one series. It's going to be asking them to do it in at least two. Because let's say things go the way we're kind of expecting. You're going to have to do that against probably Toronto and Kyle Lowry, and then against either Eric Bledsoe or Kyrie Irving. And then, let's say it goes really well for Philly. Now you're looking against doing that against Steph Curry or Chris Paul or James Harden in the NBA Finals as the most likely teams from the West. So that becomes a major challenge. You're not asking them to do it, hey, just get us through this one series. You're going to do that for two, potentially three series. Simmons, I just don't think he's that guy. We've never really seen him defend against point guards. The occasional switch, but everybody does that in the NBA. It's can he do it all the time? Jimmy Butler, for all that he is a very good defensive player, when it's chasing around the Kyrie Irvings and the Eric Bledsoes of the world, that makes it a little harder on him because he's not used to, navigating through a bunch of screens and having to defend a bunch of ball screens. He hasn't done that in several years. We think of him doing that back in his really kind of early peak Bulls days. That's not the guy he's been for at least the last couple of seasons. So I think that's going to be a problem. To this point, I continue to say it. I continue to believe their best point guard defender on the entire roster is DJ McConnell because at least he does it on a regular basis.
Keith Smith, Yahoo NBA, right here on the Sports Bash, 97.3 ESPN. Were you at the game by chance in Orlando the other night?
I was, yes.
Okay. I asked you that because I wanted to get your take. Did you just think the Sixers just didn't bring it, didn't care, were mentally like, hey, we won 6 in a row, this trip has been a little longer than we wanted? I mean, what was your kind of takeaway at the end of that night? Because they lose at Atlanta on Saturday, then they play Orlando. Now Orlando's charging, they're playing well for the playoffs, but what did you make of Philly's kind of effort or execution or what was the message after that game about Philly that you saw in person?
Yeah, I think it was a case of let's just get home, let's get through these games. We know in the NBA when a team comes off a big win streak, they're going to lose that first game generally. They either lose close and then lose badly the next time out, or they lose badly in that first game. That's just how it goes in the NBA. I think guys have a natural tendency to really take their foot off the gas pedal and go. They looked very out of sync without Ben Simmons in the game. They just seemed off from the whole night. And they were going against an Orlando team that really at this point they need to win every single game the rest of the way. I think Philadelphia looks at it and says, we're pretty comfortably ahead of Boston and Indiana for that 3 spot. We're probably not catching Toronto. So I think of all the teams in the East outside of Milwaukee, I think they're most comfortable in their position, really saying, hey, we're kind of locked in where we're at. So there's not a ton of point to extending a lot of energy, especially if we get behind in a game. We don't need to push too hard to come back in this because what's it really going to buy us in the end?
Yeah, and I agree with you that it had that look of, hey, look, we're kind of locked into it. We had a 6-game winning streak. We beat 2 teams that a lot of people questioned if we could beat them. And we're at the stage of the season where we're ready for the playoffs, right? I mean, and then, of course, the retort is, well, if you're hungry to win a championship and you really haven't done anything in the past, can you afford to take nights like that where you just don't bring it and then do it consecutive games? That, I think, was where I think the fans have a problem.
Yeah, and I think that's fair to question that, but I do think all these teams, it used to be that unless you were a true title contender or a team that had already won one, that having that attitude of just get it to the playoffs doesn't matter. I think we're seeing more and more of these teams say, I know when the real season starts here. As long as I'm going to get there and in a comfortable position, then that's when I'm really gonna go all in and get after it. And I think that's where Philadelphia is. Now, the rest of their schedule, outside of a game against Milwaukee and maybe a game at Miami, is pretty favorable.
Well, it sounds like he just kind of vanished. And, it's funny, I tweeted this out the other day. The Sixers' schedule coming up, they've got 9 games left, including tonight. No, tomorrow. What day of the week is it? Today's Wednesday. They play tomorrow against the Nets, which is a tough, that Nets team is a possible playoff preview, by the way, and a Nets team who's given them some issues. We'll get into it with Keith in just a minute. We get him back on the horn here. But they got some tricky road games coming up against lesser teams. They play at the Bulls. They play at the Heat. They play at Atlanta again. But right now, the playoffs would be Philly and Brooklyn. If the playoffs were to start tonight, it'd be 3-6 Philly, Brooklyn. So Keith Smith back on the line with us here on the Boardwalk on the Hotline. Yahoo Sports covers the NBA. And you were just talking about their schedule coming up. They got Brooklyn tomorrow, which would be a playoff preview. But their schedule seems light, but they got some tricky road games. Like they play at Atlanta again. They've got the Heat coming up again. They got to play at Chicago where they struggled the last time they went out there. So it looks like record-wise an easy slate the rest of the way.
Yeah, it really does. I think if they can get to a point where they're, finish this out 5-3, 6-2, you're feeling great about it. If you hit a point where they finish out 3-5, or God forbid 2-6, then you've got some cause for concern, because that's probably just throwing away a few too many games down the stretch that you really can't afford to. But for them, it's all about the playoffs. It's about getting there healthy and being there now, because that's what they're focused on.
All right, let's flip over to where Boston is now, because obviously Philly beats Boston a week ago from tonight. Now, in that game, Smart gets thrown out, and now there's a lot of Philly people that aren't Brett Brown guys, and they're saying, well, Philly finally won. Well, if Smart doesn't get thrown out, do they really win that game? I'll let you comment on what has happened since Boston played Philly and what happened. Did anything happen in that night that makes you think that Philly possibly has flipped the script against Boston? I don't want to say it has their number, but can now confidently say we can beat Boston in a 7-game series.
Yeah, I mean, the main reason you feel confident is they actually did it, because we've seen them lose to the Celtics without, any number of guys in there for Boston in the past. So you look at it and say, hey, it was a mostly full-strength Celtics team, and we did beat them. So that really is important. And I think the other big takeaway for why they should feel good is Joel Embiid played great. And he had a mindset of, I'm going to dominate, I'm going to go out and win this. Now, asking him to do that 4 times in a 7-game series, that's a big ask if those two should meet again. But at least Embiid now knows, like, hey, this is here if I need it. I can really make, this happen against this team. Whether they would have won if Smart got thrown out or not, that's hard to know. But at the end of the day, I always go back to what the coaches will tell you. It doesn't matter. They did win. That's all that really does matter.
Yeah, and, a lot has been made of Embiid and Horford and how that matchup is kind of go. Embiid finally seemed to kind of get one up there. And a lot of times, Keith, yes, there has been nights where it seems that Boston just kind of has Philly's number. But oddly, in the games where they've played, Philly has just not made shots. J.J. Redick has had bad shooting nights. Tobias Harris had the bad shooting night. And Boston, you had Aaron Baines hitting threes in that playoff series last year. Rozier was on fire. The Celtics have made a lot of shots, and the Sixers have not shot well, particularly in the matchups head-to-head.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. Now, I will say Boston gets the shots they want with more ease against Philly. I think they use, again, that lack of a point guard defender, whether that was Rozier last year or Kyrie Irving this year. They've really used that quite well to be able to get the shots that they want, so that's making a big difference. And then Boston does defend the three-point line better than most teams do. They're running on a streak of over 10 years of being top 5 in three-point defense, which is generally a stat you consider to be somewhat lucky, where you land out, because it's really kind of hard. You're more focused on, do you limit attempts? But the Celtics have really done it quite well, really better than anybody else has. So I think that factors in as well. But, I think Philadelphia, ultimately at the end of the day, what they did was they said, we have a better weapon here that they just can't match with Joel Embiid. We're going to play through him and go at them and make them, defend him or foul him, for better or for worse.
Keith Smith, Yahoo NBA here, and what the Celtics recently here, they beat the Cavs the other night, finally, to snap that 4-game losing streak. I know we talked a couple of weeks ago, they had gone out west, they robbed the Warriors, they beat the Kings, and it felt like, all right, that Kings game was kind of a sign that they were coming around. Then they beat the Lakers. They had won, 5 out of 6. Where did this 4-game streak all of a sudden come from? And some bad losses in there. I mean, they lose at home to the Spurs. They didn't just get beat by the Spurs. They got blitzed by the Spurs. There's a team meeting afterwards or some sort of meeting. Stevens doesn't come out for a half an hour. So what has happened to them since beating the Hawks 129-120?
Yeah, I wish I knew. If I did, I'd probably be making a ton of money, fixing them. But this is how it's been all year for this team. They have these moments, like you said, they hammered the Warriors, and you're like, well, there it is. There's the team that can, potentially even win an NBA title. And then they have these performances against these bad teams or sometimes against good teams where they just look awful. The Spurs game was really kind of a debacle from the sense that it just looked really, really bad from the jump in that one.
Yeah, and that's something that you say. We kind of opened up with the Sixers battling with these bad teams where they show up against the better teams and they beat the better teams, and then they struggle against the bad teams. The Celtics have had that issue seemingly all year as well. They beat the good teams. Like, they've been in the games. They beat the top teams. Their struggle is against the bad teams. You look at a Celtics game and say, you lost to the Hornets? You lost to teams like that. You're kind of looking up and down at some of their losses, scratching your head sometimes.
Yeah, you absolutely are. I mean, they lost 2 games to the Phoenix Suns, who are one of the worst teams in basketball. They've been in a bunch of games with the New York Knicks, who at this point, they have every interest but winning basketball games. So it's really been a problem all year for the Celtics. And I think we've got a lot of these teams that in the NBA now, they tend to play down to their competition. I think it's this mindset of just get through those games and save it for the big games. Again, I think the NBA has hit kind of a tipping point where you have a whole bunch of teams who believe we can make a deep playoff run. So that's what we're focused on. We're not worried about, winning a game in, February, March, because who really cares? That's not going to do anything for it. It doesn't count for anything in late April, May, and June.
Amen, man. I try to get that message out there to our listeners all the time. I joke all the time now that, hey, a Tuesday night in February, it doesn't matter who you're playing. Wacky things happen all the time. I mean, in the same night that, Golden State lost by 35 to Dallas, Boston lost to the Hornets, the Sixers lost to somebody, you're looking at it and saying, I can't explain some of these things. But I want to ask you about Brooklyn, because Philly plays them tomorrow, and if the playoffs were to begin right now, it would be Brooklyn. Now, they've had their issues against Brooklyn. Is Brooklyn a team that could scare the Sixers in the playoffs?
Yeah, you want to say yes because, again, that point guard issue, they're going to have to find somebody who can defend D'Angelo Russell. And then when he comes out of the game, Spencer Dinwiddie. And then when, obviously, they play a lot of minutes together, too, and that's always tough. It stresses the defense when you have to defend 2 ball handlers. But, overall, the Nets, run so hot and cold. They're really relying on their outside shooting being good. And if they're not making shots, it's really them. They have to rely then often on comebacks and things like that. As well as Jarrett Allen has played, don't have an answer for Joel Embiid outside of him. And even that's a questionable answer at best, maybe. That's a half a fill-in on the, choose your multiple choice. I don't know that that's a full one. So I think it's for Philly, you feel confident you're going to get a lot offensively. It's just, holding them down just enough defensively, and they should be fine.
We'll see. Tonight, Sixers-Celtics, that game, Sixers-Nets, that game is on 97.3 ESPN. The Sixers went to Milwaukee and beat the Bucks, all right? Impressive win. The Bucks have turned some things back on, though. They had Brogdon out. He'll be out for at least the first round of the playoffs. They lost Mirotic, so they seemed like they were having some issues, but all of a sudden they've won 7 out of 10, 3 in a row, 56-19, very good home team. Do you say that Milwaukee is the best shot to beat the Warriors in the entire league?
No, I don't think so. I think Houston is. I think Houston has played really well last night, notwithstanding. They've really figured it out. They know that they can beat the Warriors. They had them on the ropes last year. And I'm not even sure Milwaukee, just because of the health issues, is the best team to position to come out of the Eastern Conference, because they're going to get through the first round with, what should be relative ease. But the second round and beyond is just how great he was playing. He's a 50-40-90 guy, 50% from the field, 40% from three-point, 90% from the foul line. And that's huge for them. Beyond that, they've also lost Nikola Mirotic, who is a big bench addition for them. And that's really tough. And Giannis Antetokounmpo, it's not just rest. He's going through, he's beat up and bruised, and it's been a long season. So they're going to have to really, get this together to be able to beat, Boston, Philly, Toronto, whoever it is that they have to beat in the second and third rounds to even get to the finals.
All right. Milwaukee's in, Toronto's in, Philly's in, Indiana's in, and now Boston has clinched. But you got Brooklyn, Detroit, Orlando, Miami. I guess you could throw Charlotte into that mix. Of that group of teams, Brooklyn, Detroit, Orlando, Miami, Charlotte, which team would you be most fearful of if you got matched up with in the first round?
I would probably say Brooklyn just because of that high variance 3-point shooting. If they get hot for a week, they can really make your life miserable from there. Detroit, they're just old school. Their offense playing through two bigs, that's really tough. You can really shut that down. Orlando's offense goes missing big time at times, and I'm not sure Miami and Charlotte are even going to have enough to get to the playoffs. While Charlotte's played a little bit better as of late, those two teams are they've got so many struggles. So I would really choose Brooklyn out of that group.
All right, and in the West, you've got 5 teams locked in. How about the Clippers, man? 45. They trade Harrison. They've been outstanding. They've won 6 in a row, 9 out of 10. They're 15 games over 500. That story has been unbelievable over the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, Doc Rivers deserves a lot of love for Coach of the Year. He's not going to get it because there's some other guys whose teams have won, a lot of games, but Doc deserves all the love. This may be the best coaching job he's done since he was with the Celtics and won an NBA title. He's, the fact that not only were they good and in the mix pre-trade deadline, but then when they really went and traded half the roster away, and it looked like they were saying, all right, we're going to drop out of the playoffs here and start on this rebuild. And he's just kept them cranking along. That's a fantastic coaching job by him. And a lot of credit to their guys are a bunch of scrappy guys who were kind of teams had given up on, and here the Clippers are, battling their whole way.
The Nurkic injury the other night, what's that do for Portland? I mean, they're the 3 seed right now. I know they might not finish. They remind me of what happened last year when Butler got hurt for Minnesota. They were like the 3 seed and then dropped down to 8. Could you see Portland, take a tumble possibly down to the 8 seed? I don't know, maybe they're 4 up, but I mean, they're probably not going to land in that 3 spot.
No, yeah, it'll be tough for them to hang in there. Nurkic is a huge loss. He was having a career year, borderline all-star kind of numbers that he was putting up for them. They're also down C.J. McCollum. It sounds like he may be out for the rest of the regular season, and you always worry. Now you got to work him back in, and hopefully he's healthy and his wind is up and all that for a playoff series. So that's going to be a problem for them. Portland is as a franchise, going all the way back to Luke Walton. You look at that, Bill Walton, his dad, is what I meant to say. You go all the way back to there and you say, man, what could have been with, any number of guys throughout Trailblazers history. And it's just, unfortunate that they run into these major injuries, especially when it finally looks like they're starting to put some things together and maybe turning the corner a little bit.
Greg Oden, of course, number 1 pick, who really flamed out for them. Keith Smith and I, we talk NBA every Wednesday at this time. As we know, Sixers play the Nets tomorrow night. And as Keith kind of said, the breaks, you don't have to go so crazy when they lose a couple against bad teams. It is frustrating, but it is not the story, which has been pretty good. 47-27 Philly in the 3 spot. Probably not going to catch Toronto. Probably not going to drop behind Indiana. So it looks like a 3 seed for Philly with 9 games left to go. Keith, we will do it again next week and have probably a more clear playoff picture. Thanks, pal.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.